In Kingston Hollow, there was this guy, Jake Miller, who took up the family mantle of guarding the old governor's tomb. His mom, Martha Miller, was the queen of the pancake feast. Seriously, her cooking was the talk of the town. She whipped up dishes so tasty they kept Jake well-fed and stocky. Jake's dad, though? He'd been out of the picture for years. Some folks swore he took a nasty tumble off a ridge and didn't make it. Others whispered he'd slacked off on tomb duty and got cursed by Governor Preston's ghost. A few even claimed Jake somehow jinxed his own dad to death. Rumors flew like wildfire, each one crazier than the last. But the real story behind his dad's death?
Only Jake knew the truth.
He was there when it happened, the last one by his father's side. No matter how much the townsfolk pried, Jake's lips stayed sealed tighter than a vault. Not even Martha could get a word out of him. Over time, the gossip took a dark turn. Some started pointing fingers, saying Jake might have had a hand in his dad's demise and just didn't have the guts to fess up. Martha, though? She'd just chuckle at the chatter. She knew her boy better than anyone and wouldn't push him to spill something he wasn't ready to share. She didn't know the full story either, but she wasn't about to force it out of him. Besides keeping watch over the tomb and the old Preston estate, Jake would head up into the hills to hunt when he had the chance. If he didn't, him and Martha would have been scraping by on empty stomachs. One day, Jake and his best buddy, Tommy Carter, made plans to hit the woods for a hunting trip. Tommy was an orphan. Life had dealt him a rougher hand than Jake. His dad and Jake's dad had been thick as thieves, sworn brothers from way back. That bond carried over to the next generation, making Jake and Tommy tighter than kin. Tommy's mom passed away giving birth to him, and his dad met a grim end, slipped off a cliff while hunting, body never found. Left on his own, Tommy got by thanks to the two families being so close. Martha, being the neighborly type, called Tommy over for meals every day after he lost his folks. To Tommy, she was as good as his own mom. Bright and early, Tommy rolled up to Jake's place, bursting into the yard with a grin. He pulled a shiny new hunting bow from behind his back and hollered, "Jake, check this out.
Ain't my new Rika beauty?
We're coming back loaded today, no question." After strutting around like a peacock, Tommy grabbed Jake, ready to hightail it to the hills. Just then, Martha bolted out of the house yelling, "Hold up, boys.
Don't you dare yet."
She dug into her apron pocket and pulled out 2 little leather pouches, each with a small wooden charm inside. Handing them over to Jake and Tommy, she said, "Listen up, my boys. These are good luck charms I got from the chapel yesterday.
Keeping on you.
If trouble comes knocking, they'll see you through." Jake rolled his eyes and groaned, Ma, come on, don't start with this stuff. We're 2 grown guys, tough as nails."
What's gonna happen?
He flexed his arm, showing off his bicep like a show-off. "Look at this, Ma, pure strength." Martha wasn't having it. She swatted the back of his head and snapped, "I'll give you a smack upside the head. You're wearing it, and that's final."
Quit your yapping.
Tommy, ever the peacemaker, jumped in, "Jake, why you gotta rile her up?"
You tired of living? Ma don't worry, we'll take 'em. I get it, a motors worry never quits.
He took the charms from her with a smile, tucking one into his pocket and handing the other to Jake. Martha nodded, "See?
Tommy's reliable one.
You just like to get under my skin." With that, she watched her 2 boys head off, a mix of pride and worry in her eyes. Jake and Tommy trudged along, chatting as they went, their boots kicking up dust on the old Virginia trail. As they neared the top of Pine Ridge, Tommy piped up, "Weather's holding nice today, huh? We're making good time, already at this ridge. Ain't this the spot where your pa went down all those years back? Folks in town said when they found you, you were half-starved, passed out cold. If they hadn't spotted you when they did, you'd have been a goner too." Jake's face went stone-cold quiet, his jaw tightening. Tommy realized he'd stepped in it. Sure, he'd just been musing out loud, not meaning to poke the bear, but he'd hit Jake's sore spot dead on. He knew better than to bring up Jake's dad. Every time it came up, Jake clammed up like a vault, hiding some deep hurt he'd never let see daylight. Tommy, being the sunny type despite his own hard knocks, hated seeing his buddy down. He backpedaled fast. "All right, forget I said it, my bad, okay?
Don't go all silent on me. We're brothers, man, if you don't wanna talk, I won't push."
How about we park it over by that big rock up ahead? There's a spring nearby, let's grab a drink and cool off. They found a shady spot under a towering oak, plopping down on a flat boulder. Jake grabbed his canteen and wandered over to a crack in the rocks where a trickle of mountain water ran clear and cold, filling it up. They stretched out on the stone, letting the breeze whistle past their ears, pure bliss after the climb. But after a spell, the breeze carried something else, a faint cry for help. Jake bolted upright. "You hear that?" Sounded like someone yelling, "Save me." Tommy nodded. "Yeah, I caught it too. Thought it was just my head playing tricks, but if we're both hearing it, maybe we ought to check it out. That voice. Feels like I've heard it somewhere before." They locked eyes, no words needed, just a quick nod, and they were off, heading deeper into the woods toward the sound. It was their unspoken pact, one look, and they moved as a unit, no questions asked. The farther they went, the louder the cries got, sweat beading on their foreheads as they pushed through the brush. Years of hunting had honed their instincts, and right now, those instincts were screaming danger. They picked up the pace, branches snapping underfoot, until they burst into a clearing. There, an old man with a shock of white hair, lugging a sack of herbs, was backed up against a tree. A massive black bear loomed over him, roaring and pounding its chest, for bristling like a storm cloud ready to burst. The old-timer was yelling for help, scrambling backward, only to trip over a gnarled root and hit the dirt hard. If he hadn't spent his life traipsing these hills gathering plants, a fall like that at his age would have sent him straight to the undertaker. "Watch out!" Jake bellowed, charging forward as the bear reared up, claws flashing. He threw himself between the old man and the beast, drawing its attention. Thwack! Tommy saw his chance. Sneaking around back, he leapt onto the bear, wrapping his arms around its thick neck. Man and bear tumbled across the ground, rolling over rocks and roots. The bear roared, furious at the surprise attack, and started thrashing in circles, trying to shake Tommy loose. But Tommy clung on like a burr, gripping fistfuls of fur, stubborn as a mule with a grudge. The bear switched tactics, dropping flat to the ground, rump hiked up, and let out a stench so foul it could peel paint, some kind of five-alarm spicy backwoods fart. Tommy gagged, eyes watering, choking out a string of curses as the smell hit him like a freight train. His grip slipped just a hair, and the bear tried to bolt. With a primal yell, Tommy hauled back, muscles straining, and flung the bear's bulk sideways. It crashed into a row of saplings, snapping them like twigs. Now the bear was pissed. It lumbered up, sucking in a huge breath. Wind whipped through the clearing, leaves swirling like a tornado. It locked onto Jake and the old man, huffing and puffing like it meant to suck them right into its jaws. Jake felt the pull, like he was about to get swallowed whole. He yanked his hunting knife from his belt and jammed it into the earth, anchoring himself. "Help! Save me!" the old man wailed, too frail to hold his ground against the gusts. Jake saw him sliding toward the bear's claws. No time to think. He dove, grabbing the man's legs and heaving with all he had, chucking him clear of danger. But that left Jake wide open, staring down the bear's slashing paws, inches from getting torn apart. Right as the bear's claws swooped down, a sharp twang cut through the chaos. Tommy had knocked an arrow on his new bow and let it fly, bullseye, straight through the bear's paw. The beast howled, stumbling back, the wind dying down as it dropped to one knee, dazed. The clearing went still, save for the bear's heavy panting. Tommy shouted, "Jake, get him out of here. I'll handle this thing, go, or we're all done for." Jake didn't argue. He scrambled to the old man's side. "You okay, mister? Can you walk?" The guy shook his head. "I can hobble, but running's out of the question at my age."
"Lime, son, Ivy had my time."
"No chance," Jake grunted, crouching low. "Hop on my back, quick, we're getting you out." The old man hesitated, then climbed on muttering, "Bless you kid, going through all this for an old coot like me." Jake hoisted him up and took off down the hill, legs pumping until he was sure the bear wasn't on their tail. He set the man down gently by a fallen log, catching his breath. "You're safe now, mister. Sit tight, I gotta check on Tommy. That bear's too much for one guy." Without waiting for a reply, he sprinted back up the slope. When he reached the clearing, Tommy was sprawled out on the ground, motionless. Jake's heart sank. He knelt, pressing fingers under Tommy's nose, still breathing, thank God. Relief washed over him, but then Tommy's eyes popped open, startling Jake so bad he fell back on his rear. "What the hell, man?" Jake snapped. "You weren't out, why didn't you say something?" Trying to give me a heart attack? How'd you take that bear down? You good to move, or do I gotta carry you too? Tommy smirked, eyes fluttering shut again. I'm beat, all right? Gave it everything I had, just need a minute to rest. That charm Ma gave us? Saved my bacon. Bear came at me, I chucked it at him. Thing tore apart in its claws, sparked up like a firecracker, and spooked it off. Guess it didn't like the heat. Jake hauled Tommy up, slinging him over his shoulder, and trekked back to where he'd left the old man. The three of them sat there, catching their breath, and finally got to talking. Jake plopped Tommy down next to the old man, who was still catching his breath by the log. Wiping sweat from his brow, Jake squinted at the guy. Say, ain't you old man Perry from town? Ezra Perry, right? The old-timer stroked his scruffy beard and chuckled. Well, I'll be, you know me, huh? Tommy, still winded but perking up, jumped in. Course we do. You might not remember us too well, but everyone calls you the living saint of Kingston Hollow. You're a walking encyclopedia. Stars, plants, you name it, and your doctoring skills? Top-notch. Always patching folks up for free. Ma's always telling us we ought to be more like you, Ezra. Honest, kind, doing right by people. Bet you were up here gathering herbs for some sick soul when that bear got the drop on you, huh? Ezra grinned, his weathered face creasing. Flattery'll get you everywhere, boys. But yeah, you nailed it, I was foraging for a patient. Darn near became bear chow instead. Owe you to my life today, thank you. Jake waved it off. Nah, Ezra, you've been racking up good karma for years. This was just the universe paying you back. We're square. After a bit more rest, Jake hoisted Ezra onto his back again, while Tommy grabbed a sturdy stick to use as a crutch. The trio hobbled down the hill together, a ragtag crew of survivors. Once they dropped Ezra off at his little cabin on the edge of town, Jake and Tommy split off to their own places. Jake barged through his front door hollering, Ma, you won't believe what went down today. He waited for her usual bustling response. Nothing. He shouted again, pacing the yard, but the house stayed silent as a grave. Frowning, he headed for the back room. Just as he reached the curtain, Martha pushed it aside and stepped out, looking pale and worn. Jake, you're back, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake studied her, uneasy. He'd been itching to spill the whole bear saga, but something was off. Ma, you all right? You look beat, and it's dark as pitch in here. Why ain't the lanterns lit? You're usually on me to light 'em before the sun's even down. She shook her head. I'm fine, son. Just a long day. How'd the hunting go? Hungry? I'll whip you up some supper. Jake froze. Supper? Martha never cooked at home, never. She'd spent his whole life hustling at neighbors' pancake feasts or over at Widow Lee's place, where she'd fix meals for the old gal, Jake, and Tommy to share. Her offering to cook now, out of the blue, set his nerves jangling. Jake forced a grin, playing along to see where this was headed. Starving, Ma. Don't need much, just some fried chicken to hit the spot. Then, unable to hold back, he blurted, Ma, you won't believe it, me and Tommy took down a huge black bear today. Sent it running for the hills. He was mid-story when Martha's mouth twitched, like a dog baring its teeth for a split second, before smoothing back into a smile. That's so, she rasped, her voice rough as gravel. Well, ain't that something? Hang on, I'll get that chicken going. She shuffled toward the kitchen, leaving Jake blinking after her. That wasn't her voice. Too deep, too gritty, like a man's. Unease crept up his spine. He trailed her quietly, peeking into the kitchen. There she was, just sitting by the stove, staring at nothing. Ma, ain't you cooking? He asked, voice tight. She glanced up. Oh, I forgot where I put the flour. Getting old, you know, memories shot. Just resting a sec. Jake pointed to a shelf, flowers right there, same as always. She nodded, and he stepped back out, heart thudding. A few minutes later, she emerged with a plate, empty as a promise from a snake oil salesman, and set it on the table. Jake stared at it, silent for 3 beats, then said, Ma, I reckon I'm too full now. Think I'll hit the hay, save that for later. Her face flickered with something. Confusion? Annoyance? Before she murmured, all right then. I'll turn in too. Eat it later here. She drifted off to her room. Jake bolted to his own, kicking off his boots and diving under the quilt, hand wrapped tight around his knife. He lay there, ears straining, every creak of the house amplified in the dark. About an hour later, long enough for a candle to burn low, Jake caught a faint rustle. His eyes snapped open. There at the foot of his bed sat Martha, or something wearing her shape, staring at him with eyes sharp as a hawk's. In the dim moonlight, her head shifted. Fur sprouted, jaws stretched, and suddenly it was the bear's snarling face glaring down at him. Clawed hands lunged for his throat. Jake reacted on instinct, flinging the quilt over its head and kicking hard, sending it stumbling. "You damned bear," he roared. "What did you do to my ma?" The creature ripped the blanket off, growling, "Sharp one, ain't ya? Figured me out already? How'd you know I wasn't her? Makes me madder than a wet hen." Jake smirked, adrenaline pumping, easy as pie. "Ma don't cook here, ever. Even if she did, she'd know where the flour's at. You didn't have a clue. And that spot I pointed to? Empty shelf, no flour, no nothing. You cooked there, brought me an empty plate. No human'd mess up that bad, knew you weren't real the second you opened your mouth." The bear thing snarled, claws gleaming, clearly ticked at being outsmarted. Jake braced himself, mind racing back to what Ezra had said on the way down the hill. The old man had muttered something about that bear maybe being possessed by a restless spirit, one with a grudge. "If it comes for you," Ezra warned, "a splash of young feller's piss'll freeze it up long enough to run. Don't fight it head-on, you'll lose." Jake, still a bachelor at heart, grinned grimly. "Perfect. Problem was, how do you aim that in a pinch?" "Screw it," he muttered, "ugly or not, I'm staying alive." He yanked down his breeches, let loose on them, and whipped them off, hurling the dripping mess at the bear's face. "Catch, you bastard." The stench hit, and the bear froze mid-lunge, stiff as a statue. Jake didn't wait. Knife in hand, he bolted out the door, half-dressed but alive, hollering for Tommy as he tore through the night. Jake tore out of the house, breeches half on, knife clutched tight, yelling, "Tommy, get out here, bear's in my place." By some stroke of luck, Tommy had heard the ruckus from next door and was already barreling toward him, lantern swinging. They collided in the narrow alley between their houses, Tommy's eyes bugging out at Jake's state. "Jake, what in tarnation? You running around like a jaybird now? No pants, Maud tan your hide." Jake shot him a glare that could have melted iron. "I've got drawers on, you jackass. Quit gawking. That bear's back, and it got into my house. Had to ditch the pants to shake it, long story. We need Ezra now." The commotion had roused Kingston Hollow. Lanterns flickered to life, doors creaked open, and folks stumbled out, rubbing sleep from their eyes. Just then, the bear burst through Jake's roof, splintering shingles like kindling, and landed in the yard with a bellow. The crowd gasped, grabbing whatever they could, hunting bows, pitchforks, even a rusty musket or two, and let loose. Arrows zipped, tines jabbed, but it was like tossing pebbles at a brick wall. The bear shrugged it off, snarling, "Mosquito bites, you fools." It reared up, towering over the street, and clapped its paws. A gust ripped through, strong enough to peel roofs clean off, sending tiles and screams flying. Jake stepped forward, chest heaving, "This is my fight, you overgrown rug. I roughed you up, leave these folks alone. Stand down." The bear's eyes glinted, zeroing in on him. "You miserable worms," it roared, "sitting on treasure and whining about your pitiful lives. I'll wipe this town out, then dig up what's mine." It lunged, claws slashing air, but before it could close the gap, a frail figure hobbled into the fray, Ezra Perry, leaning on his stick, panting from the run. Jake grabbed his arm. "Ezra, what's this thing yammering about? How do we stop it? It's gone plumb loco." Ezra's face darkened. That bear's lost to a vengeful spirit, its mind's drowned in obsession. Ain't much time left, for it's too far gone. "Only way," he trailed off, swallowing hard. "Only way what, Ezra? Spit it out." Jake pressed, desperation creeping in. Ezra sighed, glancing at Tommy. "Only way's a tough one, boys." Tommy nodded grimly. "I get it. If I don't step into the fire, who will? Pa's debt's mine to settle. Let me finish this." Jake stared at Tommy, brow furrowing. "What are you on about, Pa's debt? What's that got to do with this?" Tommy took a deep breath, eyes steady. "Your pa and mine, they were brothers, not just by blood but by oath. Way back, our kin were picked to guard Governor Preston's tomb. Generations passed, and it fell to them. They were tight, Jake, till they weren't. Your pa, Ben Miller, swore to protect that grave, said it was our duty to the colony, to the land. Keep the governor's rest sacred, and the hallowed prosper. My pa, Hank Carter, saw it different. Said we were starving out here, guarding dirt, when we could crack that tomb open, sell the loot, and lift the whole town up. Ben called it betrayal, spat that it went against everything our families stood for. Hank figured Ben was just too stubborn to see sense. They fought over it, Jake, bitter, ugly rose. Ben thought Hank'd cool off, but greed got the better of him. One night, up on Pine Ridge by the tomb's hidden entrance, only us keepers knew where, Hank turned on Ben. Tried to bash his skull in, take the treasure for himself. You were there, Jake, just a kid trailing your pa. Ben fought like a lion, kept Hank from the prize, but it cost him. Hank slipped, went over the cliff, no body left to bury. Ben was tore up bad, knew he was done. Told you to hold the line, be a true keeper, said Hank was blinded by gold, not evil. Made you swear to keep it quiet, shield Hank's name, and mine. You've carried that ever since, ain't you? Jake's mouth hung open, memories flooding back, the blood, the fall, his pa's dying words. Tommy kept going, I've known Jake. Figured it out years back. Pa wasn't no saint. You hid it to spare me the shame, and I played along. But that bear? It's him, Hank's ghost, stuck on that greed, riding this critter like a puppet. Ezra told me a while ago, said pa's soul couldn't rest, too tangled up in wanting that loot. It's been biding its time, and now it's here to settle scores. Jake's head spun, but he gripped Tommy's shoulder. So what's the play? How do we end this? Tommy unslung his new bow, pressing it into Jake's hands. Ezra caught wind of some strange signs in the sky, made me craft this special. You're the better shot, Jake. Take it. Ezra shuffled over, muttering under his breath. He pressed a gnarled finger to Jake's forehead, then Tommy's. A warm glow flared. Jake lit up like a torch, while Tommy shimmered, shrinking into a golden arrow that floated up, knocking itself on the bowstring. Jake's gut twisted. What in the Tommy? One shot, Jake, Ezra rasped. Aim true, heart of the beast. It's the only way. Jake steadied himself, bow taut, the arrow humming with life. Just as he drew back, Tommy's voice echoed in his skull. Make it count, brother, don't embarrass me. Look after Ma, too. And for Pete's sake, keep your pants on, girls'll run screaming if you don't. Jake's throat tightened. Tommy was saying goodbye. We'll get hitched together after this, he thought back, a silent vow. Then with a sharp twang, the arrow flew, a streak of gold piercing the bear's chest dead center. The beast staggered, crashing down as the arrow vanished. A shadow rose from its corpse, shrieking, "You rotten curs! My gold! My gold!" before fading into the night. A rush of heat surged through Jake. He felt stronger, alive, but Tommy was gone. Ezra, where's he at? Jake demanded, voice cracking. Ezra's eyes softened. Feel that warmth? That's Tommy's last gift. He's in you now, carry his share, guard the hollow like you both swore. Then he laid it all bare, Tommy's sacrifice, knowing one of them had to go. Jake dropped to his knees, pounding the dirt, tears cutting trails through the grime. Tommy, you damn fool, why'd it have to be you? I'll keep our promise, I swear, both our family's honor. Jake was still reeling when the bear, freed from whatever had possessed it, stirred. It lumbered to its feet, shaking off the daze, and the crowd flinched, shouts of "Run!" rippling through. Hold it! Ezra barked, raising a hand. No need to panic, this bear's harmless now. I'd stake my life on it. He's the guardian of Pine Ridge, big ol' softy really. Helps lost hunters, never hurts a soul. Trust me, folks. The townspeople hesitated, but Ezra's word carried weight in Kingston Hollow. He'd seen more than most, and they knew it. Ezra limped over to the bear, calm as you please, inspecting the arrow wound in its paw. He rummaged in his herb sack, pulled out some leaves he'd gathered that afternoon, and mashed them into a poultice, smearing it over the injury before wrapping it with a strip of cloth. The bear, like it had known Ezra forever, dipped its head low, paws pressed to the ground in a sort of bow, gratitude plain as day. Then with a low huff, it turned and lumbered off into the dark woods, vanishing up the ridge. Jake never forgot that night. He took his duty to heart, guarding the Preston tomb, keeping the hollow safe, shouldering the weight for both families. Word of the bear fight spread, and Kingston Hollow started drawing curious travelers. The pancake feast grew into a proper draw too. Folks passing through had to try it, sampling the colonial grub Governor Preston swore by. Jake's pa, Ben Miller, went down as a hero in the tales, a man who stuck to his guns, died for his principles, and even in his last breath protected his brother's name. That kind of grit wasn't common stock, a real gentleman of the frontier. Hank Carter, Tommy's pa, came off different, greedy, selfish, his own mess dragging his son down with him. Folks reckoned he got what was coming, a cautionary yarn spun around campfires. Tommy, though? He knew his pa's sins, stepped up anyway, and gave everything to set it right. That took guts, more than most could muster, growing up in that shadow and still turning out golden. Hope we can all be like him, the old-timers say, keeping a steady heart through the storm, clean as a whistle despite the mud. This tale's about passing down the old ways, urging folks to do good, lean on those classic virtues, nothing to do with hocus pocus. Thanks for listening. First story's done. Stick around for the next one. Alright folks, that's the end of our first yarn, I say, tipping an imaginary hat. Ryan's Tales has got another one lined up for you. Don't touch that dial. I reckon you've been hooked since the jump, and this next one's a doozy. Title's The Bullying Big Sis and Scheming Brother, How They Picked on the Mute Kid and Hit a Brick Wall. Ever met a pair like that? Siblings screwing over their quiet kin for their own gain, only to slam face first into trouble? Let's roll back to the 1800s, out in Tennessee, a little spot called Danville where this all went down. Picture this, a family in Danville, run by a fella everyone just called Doc Taylor, last name stuck, 'cause his kin had been running a clinic for generations. Healers, through and through, with a knack folks swore was near magic. Doc had a daughter, Sally Taylor, apple of his eye since her ma passed young from fever. He never remarried, poured all he had into raising her, spoiled her rotten, some say. Then there were his two apprentices. First was Nate Grayson, a shifty cousin's kid from down the line, sent to learn the trade. Second was Will Taylor, no bloodkin mind you, just a mute boy Doc found up in the hills, half dead in a bundle, saved from a cougar's jaws by a hunter. The rags on him hinted he came from money, but that throat wound left him silent for good. Doc took him in, gave him the family name, and raised him up. Will Taylor was 2 years younger than Sally, Doc's pride and joy. Growing up, he couldn't talk a lick. Cougar got his voice before he even had a chance to use it. That made him an easy target for Sally and Nate, who'd tease him mercilessly, calling him dummy or mute boy behind Doc's back. Will just took it with a lopsided grin, never letting it sour him. Part of it was cause of the half-a-jade pendant dangling around his neck, only thing left from whoever dumped him in those hills. Doc told him when he was little, "Don't you ever part with that, son. It's yours, no matter who comes asking." That put him square in Sally's crosshairs. She'd had her eye on that shiny green stone for years, green with envy over something Will wouldn't trade. Thing was, Will might have been mute, but he was a wizard with medicine. By his teens, he was out tending folks solo, patching up farmers and mill hands with a steady hand and a keen eye. Danville loved him for it. Patients swore he had the healing touch, even if he couldn't say a word. Whispers followed him though, shame he's a mute, boy'd have suitors lining up if he could sweet talk. Sally meanwhile, flounced around in ribbons, and Nate skulked in the shadows, both coasting on Doc's name while Will did the heavy lifting. Doc Taylor, getting on in years, started mulling over the future. He'd be dust someday, and the clinic needed a steady hand. Will was his pick, smart, solid, the kind of man who'd keep the Taylor legacy humming. Nate? Doc didn't trust him as far as he could spit. Lazy, slippery, wouldn't know a poultice from a plow. So one evening, Doc sat Sally down. "Darlin', what did you think of tying the knot with Will? He's a good un, keep the clinic in the family." Sally's head shook like a rattlesnake's tail. "No way, Pa. He's a mute, can't have folks snickering at me for marrying the silent type." Doc turned to Will, who scribbled on a slate, "Can't talk, don't want Sally shamed." Doc sighed, letting it drop. Figured that was the end of it. But Nate Grayson caught wind of that chat, and it lit a fire under him. He'd been sweet on Sally for ages, smooth talker with a silver tongue, he'd already won her over, though his real prize was the clinic. Worried Doc might still push Will into the picture, Nate hatched a plan with Sally, something low down and dirty. One night, Will trudged back late from tending an old widow with a busted hip, bone-tired and muddy. He'd barely hit the clinic doorstep when Sally sashayed out, dolled up like a saloon gal, red lips, tight dress, the works. "Will, sugar," she purred, "come up to my room, got something to talk over." Will froze, shaking his head. Sure, they called each other kin, but her bedroom? That was off limits. Bad news in a small town like Danville. She kept at it, batting lashes, cooing excuses till he caved and followed, uneasy as a cat in a rainstorm. Once inside, Sally turned up the charm, leaning close, brushing his arm, tugging at his shirt. Will bolted for the door, but she grabbed him, ripping his collar and screaming, "Help! He's after me!" Nate burst in like a hero, fist flying, decking Will square in the jaw. Will hit the floor, dazed, as Doc stormed in, face red with fury. Seeing Will sprawled out, Sally sobbing crocodile tears, Doc lost it. "You boy out. I took you in, and this is how you repay me." His chest heaved, then he clutched it, collapsing in a heap. Nate smirked, dragging Will up and tossing him into the street. Will spent the night in an old barn, rain dripping through the roof, replaying it all. He tried the clinic door days later, slate in hand to explain, but Nate blocked him every time, sneering, "Ain't nobody wanna hear from you, dummy." Will gave up, found a lean-to by the river, and set up a little healing stall, enough to keep from starving. Not long after, Sally and Nate tied the knot. Big shindig, fiddles playing, folks toasting. Will passed by that day, catching sight of Doc in the crowd. The old man smiled for the guests, but his eyes were hollow, like he'd aged a decade overnight. Soon enough, Doc stopped doctoring, too frail, too broken. Sally and Nate took over, but they'd never bothered learning the trade proper, always dumped the real work on Will. Now they just handed out pills from Doc's old recipes, half the time mixing 'em wrong. Patients dwindled, whispers turned sour, and the clinic's name started to rot. Sally and Nate bickered non-stop, her screeching, him sulking. Worse, Nate got hooked on cards down at the saloon. Took a month before the gamblers came knocking, hauling off chairs, shelves, anything worth a dime to cover his debts. Doc tried to stop him, frail hands waving, but the strain was too much. He keeled over, bedridden with a cough that wouldn't quit. Will heard the talk around town, wanted to help, but what could he do? Outcast, voiceless, he kept his distance, tending his riverbank patients. Then one day, a poster caught his eye, Danville's richest man, Silas Boone, stricken with mystery ailment. Doctors stumped. Cure him, win his daughter's hand and $1,000 cash. The town buzzed, every quack from Tennessee to Kentucky lined up at Boone's mansion, chasing that payout. Will didn't care about the girl, but that money? It could save Doc's clinic from Nate's ruin. He picked a quiet morning, slung his herb bag over his shoulder, and headed for the big house, ready to face whatever came next. Will hitched his herb bag tighter and stepped up to Silas Boone's sprawling estate, a grand old place with white columns and a porch that'd make a governor jealous. Danville's richest man had drawn a crowd. Doctors from all over, local sawbones to slick-talking out-of-towners, swarmed the gates, lured by that $1,000 prize and a shot at Boone's daughter. Most left with slumped shoulders, muttering about incurable this and hopeless that. Will wasn't here for glory, he figured healing was his calling, reward or not, but that cash could buy back Doc's clinic, undo Nate's mess. It was worth a shot. As he queued up, a familiar sneer cut through the chatter. Nate Grayson, swaggering out after his own failed try, spotted Will and lit into him. "Well, looky here, dummies come to play doctor. What's a mute gonna do?" scribbled the old man well. The line of waiting physicians snickered, fewer rivals, better odds, and joined in, jeering till the air buzzed with it. Will stood stock still, face blank, eyes on the gate. He'd heard worse from Nate growing up, this was just noise. His mind was on Doc, not these clowns. By dusk, it was Will's turn. The other docs had cleared out, some shaking their heads, others cursing their luck, and the sun dipped low, painting the mansion gold. A butler waved him in, skeptical but too tired to argue. Inside, the parlor was hushed, heavy with the smell of liniment and despair. Silas Boone lay on a velvet settee, a wiry man in his 50s who looked 70, hair white as cotton, skin sallow, breathing shallow. Beside him sat a woman, maybe 30, pretty as a picture with sharp eyes, Boone's eldest, Clara, married to a big-shot judge in Knoxville. Next to her stood a younger gal, about Will's age, spitting image of Clara but softer, Lila, the prize daughter. Clara rose, polite as pie. Evenin', sir. You're the last of 'em today. Hope you've got something the rest didn't. Will tipped his hat, then stepped to Silas, peering close. The old man's pulse fluttered like a trapped bird, his hands cold, lips tinged blue, classic poison signs, no mistake. Will'd seen it in snake bites and bad moonshine cases. Other docs must have clocked it too, so why'd they all struck out? Either they couldn't peg the toxin, or something trickier was at play. Silas twitched, restless, legs stiff like he'd been hauling lumber too long, odd for a rich man who hadn't left the house in weeks, per Clara's account. He just took to bed one day, she said, and it's been downhill since. Docs won't even turn him, say he'll choke. Will pulled a silver needle from his bag, aiming to bleed out some of the bad blood, standard for poisoning. But as he prepped, he noticed Silas's arms and chest were a pincushion, dozens of tiny marks, some fresh, some scabbed. Whoever'd been here before knew their stuff, and their technique was slicker than Will's. So why hadn't it worked? He frowned, then borrowed a handkerchief from a maid, wrapping it round his hand. With a firm press, he kneaded Silas's back, hard like working dough, ignoring the gasps from Clara and Lila. Silas groaned, face twitching, and then Will yanked his hand back fast. Out came a wriggling nightmare, a centipede, thick as a pinky, 3 inches long, thrashing in the cloth. The room erupted. Clara shrieked, Lila clapped a hand over her mouth, the butler swore. Will stayed cool, folding the bug into the hanky and tucking it in his bag. Good medicine that, if you knew how to use it. He scribbled a recipe on his slate: nightshade root, charcoal, sassafras, boil quick, dose slow. Clara snatched it, barking orders, and soon a steaming cup was pressed to Silas's lips. He's weak as a kitten, Will wrote, I'll stay the night, make sure it takes. Clara nodded, settling in too, while Lila hovered, wide-eyed. Later, Clara opened up, voice soft. I'm Judge Ramsey's wife, Clara Ramsey now. Pa's been fading, and it's torn me up. Thanks for sticking round. Will shifted, uneasy under her gaze. She kept staring, like she saw something past him. Exhaustion hit her mid-sentence. She dozed off in her chair. Will draped a throw over her, then turned back to Silas, keeping watch. By dawn, the old man stirred, mumbling, eyes foggy but open. Will tended him gentle, adjusting pillows, wiping sweat, till Silas fixed on him, staring hard at Will's chin like he wanted to speak but couldn't. Will's gut pinget. He tugged the jade pendant from under his shirt, dangling it where Silas could see. The old man's face softened, a ghost of a smile, then he drifted back to sleep. When Clara woke, Will scratched out, poison's gone. Get him up soon, sweat it out, he'll mend. She beamed, you're a miracle, mister. Stay, let's settle up. Will waved her off, got folks waiting. Back later. He grabbed his bag and slipped out, leaving Clara staring after him, whispering, if my Johnny'd lived, he'd be your age now. Sure enough, Silas staggered to the privy that morning, came back drenched in sweat, muttering, Johnny saved me, he came back. Clara's eyes welled up, brushing it off as fever talk, until Will's next visit proved her wrong. After Will left, Silas Boone perked up fast, just like Will predicted. He shuffled back from the privy, dripping sweat, face flushed but alive. Johnny came for me, he kept muttering, voice shaky, my boy looked out for me. Clara Ramsey dabbed her eyes, figuring it was delirium talking, old grief bubbling up from a dozen years back. She'd lost her son, Johnny, as a baby, and Silas had never shaken the guilt. Folks brushed it off as a sick man's ramblings, but Clara couldn't shake the ache in her chest. She sent word around Danville. Will Taylor was due his reward, $1,000, and Lila's hand, as promised. A few days later, Will trudged back to the Boone estate, herb bag slung over his shoulder. Lila met him at the door, all dolled up but fidgety, twisting her fingers. She'd been fine with the deal when it was just talk, but now, facing a mute for a husband? Her nose wrinkled and she spilled it to Clara. He's nice and all, but I can't marry a man who don't talk. Folks'll laugh me out of town. Clara didn't push, just nodded, lips tight, and waited for Will. When he stepped in, she laid out the offer, crisp bills and a shy Lila beside her. Will scratched on his slate, just the cash, ma'am, no wife needed. Clara blinked, stunned. Most men would have leapt at Lila, money or not. Why just the money? She pressed, but Will shrugged, keeping his cards close. Then Silas hobbled in, propped up by the butler, eyes lighting up at Will. He lurched forward, wrapping Will in a bear hug that nearly knocked the wind out of him. Will, used to grateful patience, hugged back, then scribbled, "How you holding up, sir?" Silas thumped his chest, grinning, "Fit as a fiddle, thanks to you." He pointed at Will's shirt, and Will pulled out the jade pendant again, letting Silas run his fingers over it. The old man's hands trembled, tears brimming, and Clara frowned. Her pa was acting plumb strange. She snatched the pendant back, handed it to Will, and ushered him out with the cash, promising to sort the rest later. But Silas's face stuck with her, too raw, too real for a fever dream. Clara couldn't let it go. She cornered Silas once Will was gone. "Pa, what's got you so riled? You're acting like you've seen a ghost." Silas sank into his chair, voice low, and spilled a story she'd heard 100 times, but this time, it hit different. 12 years back, when you and Judge Ramsey had little Johnny, I was over the moon, my first grandson. You came to visit, stayed a spell, and I couldn't get enough of that boy. When you headed home to Knoxville, I begged you to leave him a few more days. Selfish, I know. Finally, I sent him back with 3 of my best hands, gave him strict orders. Had a silversmith carve that jade piece special for him, half a moon, to match one I kept. But they never made it. You came tearing back, frantic, and we scoured the roads. Hunters found the men, torn up by cougars, no sign of Johnny. Been eating me alive ever since, my fault he's gone. Clara's knees buckled, crumpling to the floor. "My baby," she whispered, the pieces clicking, Will's pendant, Silas's ramblings. She rallied the household, "Get pa settled, I'm finding that boy." She tore out of the mansion, tracking Will's trail. Meanwhile, Will stood outside Doc Taylor's clinic, staring at a gutted shell. Gamblers swarmed the place, hauling off tables and shelves for Nate's debts. Nate slouched on the stoop, head down, taking Sally's screeched curses without a peep. Doc, frail and coughing, tried to block the door, pleading, "This is my life's work." Will couldn't watch. He marched up, grabbed a burly debt collector, and shoved the $1,000 into his hands. "Take it, clinic's mine now. Clear out." The thug grinned, pocketing the cash, and the crew scattered. Doc turned, seeing Will, and broke, half joy, half shame. "You're back, son, I failed you." Nate snapped up, lunging, "This your revenge, dummy? Rigged this with the saloon." Nobody bought it. His lies stank worse than the river. Will brushed him off, steadying Doc instead. Clara rolled in that evening, Judge Ramsey's carriage kicking up dust. She'd heard Will saved Silas and tracked him to the clinic, where Doc spilled Will's tale, found in the hills, cougar-scarred pendant and all. It sealed it. Will was Johnny Ramsey, her lost boy, Silas's grandson, heir to a judge's bloodline. The news hit like a thunderclap. Doc beamed, proud his stray found his roots. Sally and Lila kicked themselves for snubbing him. Nate slunk off, a pariah in tatters. Clara swept Will into her arms, sobbing, "My Johnny, I've got you back." Will took it quiet, like always. Even with his name and kin restored, he stuck to healing, roaming Danville, patching folks up. Along the way he met Ellie, a deaf girl from the Hollows, sweet and silent like him. Sparks flew, and they hitched up simple, no fuss. Clara, Silas, and the Ramseys didn't bat an eye. Whatever made Will happy, they owed him that much after all he'd lost. The clinic hummed again under his hands, a legacy reclaimed. That's the tale, folks. I wrap up, leaning into the mic. If you liked it, drop a comment below, subscribe, share, all that jazz. Thanks for tuning in. Catch you next time.